Voyage of the Damned, Gordon Thomas and Max Morgan Witz. Wednesday, May 3rd, 1939. The captain of the Hamburg American Line passenger ship St. Louis did not look forward to the meeting that cool Wednesday morning of May 3rd, 1939. For the first time in his 37 years at sea, Gustav Schroeder was uncertain and uneasy about a voyage. The newly pressed blue serge trousers and high-buttoning jacket were, for him, a reminder that his meeting with line director Klaus Gottfried Haltsen was to be an important one. Usually, Schroeder slipped into his favorite gray suit to go ashore for his end-of-voyage report to the marine superintendent in Hapeg House, a few blocks away from Shed 76, where the St. Louis was now tied up on the Hamburg waterfront. But this morning, when the liner berthed after another voyage from New York, Schroeder had been ordered to report personally to Haltsen. After he dressed slowly and carefully, Schroeder once more opened the wall safe in his day cabin to read the cable again to seek a clue in its content. The message had come during dinner some 800 miles out of New York, when his steward discreetly handed him the radiogram. It gave him an excuse to leave the tedious table talk about Hitler and Nazi dreams of expansion in the half-empty first-class dining room. The absence of passengers, the liner was less than a third full, was depressing evidence of the deepening world crisis. The majority on board were Germans returning from the United States. Some of them wore party badges and were pleased to see that many of the crew had also displayed the Nazi emblem on their uniforms. The fact that the captain did not cause much comment, but no one dared raise the matter with him. He was reputed to be precise, studious, and correct in all details. To his deck officers, he seemed to be of the courtly 19th century, not of the 20th. But when Schroeder was roused by something that displeased him, his language was so forceful and salty that it stunned those he addressed. He was also to be the smallest officer in the German merchant navy and the Graf on the bridge. Surplus fat, he practiced calisthenics for 20 minutes each day without fail. The only wrinkles on his face were tiny crow's feet, the temple, fencing his clear blue eyes. He had the look of a man who had measured distant horizons all his life. His hair was gray, clipped short at the temples. He had it trimmed once a week by his steward. His skin was tanned from almost a lifetime at sea. Gustav Schroeder looked like he was an energetic, experienced, and capable captain. After the cable came, Schroeder had deciphered the apparently meaningless numbers. The code had been introduced by the line to communicate confidential information to its captains at sea. In the 4 months he had commanded the 16,732-ton liner, Schroeder had never before received a coded message. The coded cable was typical of the nagging pressures now intruding on his orderly life. Recently, such pressures had exceeded the bounds of what Schroeder believed were proper company demands. He was increasingly aware of the intrusion of Nazi influence on his ship and did not like it. There had been the compulsory signing on of 6 Gestapo agents as firemen officially on board to check sabotage attempts. A few voyages before, in New York, a bomb threat had been made against the St. Louis. No bomb was found, but the rumor made it difficult for Schroeder to argue that the firemen were not needed. The Gestapo agents had tightened security precautions and made attempts to spread party doctrines to all sections of the crew. Schroeder ordered them to stop such blatant propaganda, but he knew it was impossible to enforce such an order. He personally loathed the Nazi ideology. He had steadfastly maintained to his few close friends that as long as he believed in Germany's future, as he did in the company's destiny, he would continue to oppose Hitler's doctrines, but he must do so circumspectly. The most serious influence with the captain's command was the presence of a second-class steward he had inherited when he took command of the St. Louis in February 1939. Otto Schendrick had established himself as the ship's Ortsgruppenleiter, but his powers went beyond those of merely political shop steward. He had arranged for at least 2 members of the crew to be forcefully removed from the ship for expressing attitudes not in keeping with Nazi policy. His greatest coup had been the dismissal of Captain Friedrich Buch, master of the St. Louis since its maiden voyage in 1929. Book had been escorted from the ship by Gestapo agents under Schendek's guidance. Captain Schroeder took over from Book, and during the short time he had been in command, tension had grown between him and Schendek. Each man tested the other's strengths and weaknesses, waiting for a chance to make one swift, decisive thrust that would resolve the conflict. By simply not wearing the party badge, Captain Schroeder knew he had made himself vulnerable. In the end, either he and Schendek and the Gestapo firemen would have to go. For 6 years, Schroeder had resisted requests to join the Nazi Party. Before the last voyage, a line official had called on him as the ship was about to sail and warned him that refusal to join the party might mean loss of command. Schroeder was shaken, but he ordered the man off the ship. Perhaps the radiogram was retribution for that action. The message he found was simple but mysterious. His next voyage was to be an unscheduled, special trip. He was filled with apprehension. Schroeder knew his meeting with Halvorsen was linked with that message. He had remembered that the director had responsibility within the company for all special ventures. Klaus Gottfried Halvorsen was one of the most powerful men in German shipping. Schroeder had met him only once, some 4 months earlier, shortly after taking command of the St. Louis. At a lunch given by the company for its captains, Schroeder had sat opposite Halvorsen. The director was expansive, suave, and charming. Schroeder was shocked that he had so easily accepted Nazi domination of the line. Halvorsen's optimistic predictions at that luncheon had not come true. Hamburg, America, Hapag, was in deeper financial difficulties. Schroeder hoped Halvorsen would reassure him that the line was in good health. He trusted the line would return to the old ways. In 1934, the Reich had become the majority shareholder, and the company had lost the independence it had successfully defended for 90 years. The swastika flying over the portal of the somber Hamburg house represented a major upheaval involving both the Gestapo and German military intelligence, the Abwehr. Many of the line's ships now carried espionage couriers as crew members. The Gestapo had a number of agents constantly watching the staff. Schroeder walked into Hapag House, a place that seemed to him to have little to do with the sea, filled with its clerks perched on high stools, concerned with profits and apparently little else. As he reached Halvorsen's office, he wondered whether the time had come for him to present his resignation. If not immediately, then he would do so soon. Halvorsen was in no hurry to come to the point. He had discussed the last voyage. Had there been any problems? It was the opening Gustav Schroeder wanted. He told him bluntly that there were disruptive elements on board. He described the intrusion of politically motivated persons. Halvorsen was silent. Then, in the loud, confident voice Schroeder remembered and disliked, Halvorsen said, "There are some things which are better left alone, for your own good and for the good of the company." Schroeder was too disappointed to speak. He could expect no support to rid the St. Louis of its Nazi elements. Halvorsen was speaking again, this time about the special voyage. The St. Louis was to carry nearly 1,000 refugees from Germany to Cuba. The trip would require the greatest tact on Schroeder's part. Though he was new to command, it had been decided that only Schroeder had the necessary qualities for such a voyage. "Most important of all," the director continued, "this trip will ensure that your ship is fully booked at a time when our financial resources are at a low ebb." Captain Schroeder responded to this appeal to his company loyally. He had one question. "Who are the refugees?" "Jews, but nothing out of the ordinary. Only people wanting to leave Germany," Halvorsen replied. Schroeder knew now that he must not resign until he had delivered the refugees to Cuba. But as he was driven back to the ship, he felt deeply perturbed by a conviction that the director had not been totally frank about the voyage. His first action aboard was to muster the entire ship's complement in the first-class social hall. He briefed them on the forthcoming voyage, and its passengers then took the first deliberate step toward a confrontation with Otto Schendek and the Gestapo firemen. As he announced, "Any of you who do not want to accompany these people to Cuba can sign off now." Neither Schendek, the Gestapo agents, nor anyone else said a word. Gustav Schroeder returned to his cabin, aware that he would have to take with him to Cuba members of a crew who actively hated the passengers for whom he would be responsible. The first of these passengers, the Spener family, arrived in Hamburg late that same evening of May 3rd, 10 days before the St. Louis was due to sail. They came in a car flying a swastika and driven by a young SS officer. On the long drive from Berlin, Dr. Fritz Spener repeatedly whispered to his wife that this was the most bizarre twist of fate they had experienced in 6 years of increasing persecution. The memory of his remark remains with Babette Spener to this day. In April 1933, a Nazi decree barred Jews from working in state hospitals or clinics. Within a year, Dr. Spener had to move his wife and 7-year-old twin daughters, Renee and Ines, from his comfortable home in the fashionable Berlin suburb of Dahlem to a more predominantly Jewish quarter of the city. He found work in private practice. Babette Spener was still able to dress fashionably in the Paris models offered by the Kurfürstendamm shops. The family continued to go sailing at weekends on the Way-on-Sea. They could still buy at Laux and Matzo. Dr. Spener avoided those who said there were only 2 alternatives to the worsening situation: arm and fight or leave Germany. The majority of his friends and relatives, anchored by their possessions and inured to the prospect of suffering, also stayed on. Once, out of curiosity, he had attended a meeting of an underground Zionist organization. The 20 present had listened to a young man arguing that if each Jew in Germany was prepared to kill one Nazi before being taken to the camps, the wave of arrests would end. Hitler would realize he could not continue such persecution. It might take hundreds, even thousands of lives, but it would happen. Dr. Spener had been shocked by the crudity of the plan. He could not accept that argument that those who had already gone so meekly to the concentration camps had doomed the rest. He had never attended another meeting. He ignored all the signs until July 25, 1939, when a decree drove Jewish doctors even from private practice. A few were authorized to serve their own community. Dr. Spener was one of them. 4 months later had come the Kristallnacht. On that night of broken glass, November 9th to 10th, 1938, the Nazis committed a national act of vengeance against all German Jews in the Third Reich. 191 synagogues were desecrated, 171 Jewish-owned apartment houses set on fire, 7,500 Jewish shops looted, 20,000 Jews were taken into protective custody, half of them being shipped to Buchenwald camp. The police made only 117 arrests of non-Jewish Germans. No one was ever brought to trial. The Speners escaped unhurt, but soon afterward they were forced to escape from their rented apartment to a garret owned by a widow. Her son was a medical student, and Dr. Spener befriended and helped tutor him, not knowing the youth was a member of the SS. When the student heard that the Speners were due to be arrested in the next roundup of Jews, he offered to drive the family to Hamburg. Some time before that, Dr. Spener had spent 3,000 Reichsmarks on permits for the family to enter Cuba and later, hopefully, the United States. He had kept to himself the knowledge that the permits were worthless unless the family obtained passage to Cuba. For weeks, he had haunted the Berlin travel agencies that specialized and grew fat on facilitating the departure of refugees. When he was informed of the impending arrest, he tried again, and fortunately found one agency that was selling tickets for the St. Louis. He brought 4 first-class berths for 3,200 Reichsmarks. He paid an extra 1,000 Reichsmarks for permission to take his surgical instruments out of the country. All the money had come from a relative in Canada. The family were assigned to cabins 111 and 113 on B deck. By mid-afternoon of May 3rd, they held the papers that could keep them from Dachau or Sachsenhausen or Buchenwald. Babette Spener had spent a busy afternoon, or a busy morning, selling off what remained of her household goods to buy more clothes for the twins. Renee and Ines now had enough dresses to last them for the next 5 years. She brought a top coat for her husband and a fur wrap for herself, and packed the family's remaining possessions into trunks. Babette Spener had been reluctant to leave Berlin. In spite of the insults, the taunts, the jostling on the pavements, the shops, theaters, and cinemas prescribed to her and her family, she wished to stay because, as she explained later, she was a Seidemann, and there had been Seidemans in the Ruhr for more than 400 years. We regarded ourselves as German through and through. We spoke German, we thought in German, we were German. The very idea of leaving the country where our roots were was heartbreaking. There was another, more personal reason why Babette Spener did not wish to emigrate. Her marriage was in difficulty. She feared that it could not survive a move halfway across the world, that her handsome husband might divorce her once they reached his ultimate goal, America. But faced with the sailing tickets, the specter of the Gestapo, and her husband's promise of a wonderful new life ahead, she, with the children, left Berlin. She was confronted by her husband, hands in hers, throughout the journey. That evening in Hamburg, near the railway station, their car was forced to halt by men in youths from a big Nazi rally who surrounded it. Many carried party banners on their shoulders like rifles, rolled tight against the staves. Suddenly, a squad of stormtroopers surged toward a man coming out of the railway station, carrying a cheap suitcase. He tried to flee, but the soldiers were too quick. They rammed him against the wall, kicking and jabbing him with their staves. In moments, the stormtroopers stepped back, leaving him crumpled on the sidewalk. In the back of the car, the twins whimpered. Their mother calmed them with a lullaby. Only later did she realize she had crooned a Jewish lament her mother had sung to her. As the car drove on, protected by its swastika flag and uniformed SS driver, Dr. Spener noticed dozens of people staring at the figure on the ground. Not 50 yards away, a squad of armed policemen ignored the whole incident. The Speners saw the man crawling away, shaking his shaved head, dragging his suitcase behind him. Though they did not know it, he had also come to Hamburg to board the St. Louis. That night, the young SS officer drove them to a small hotel in the old quarter of Hamburg. Inside, a sign over the desk stated, "Jews forbidden." Dr. Spener booked 2 adjoining rooms, and then the family shook hands with the benefactor who gave each of the children 10 Reichsmarks and wished them all a safe journey. Shortly afterward, 2 Gestapo officers arrived at the hotel. About a mile from the hotel, Aaron Panzer, a man who had been beaten, finally found a hiding place that even the Gestapo would have little stomach to stand. He had dragged himself down the waterfront, and there, a few cable lengths from the St. Louis, he discovered a yard stacked with animal hides from an adjoining slaughterhouse. Born and raised in a farming community, he knew the skins would be left undisturbed for weeks to cure. So, tying a handkerchief across his nose and mouth, he burrowed into the pile of skins, ignoring the dried blood and pieces of flesh, the flies, and the stench. For a man who had survived Dachau, it was not hard to bear. On Kristallnacht, 178 days ago, Posner, a Hebrew teacher, had been dragged from his home by the Gestapo and shipped to Dachau, one of some 8,000 Jews brought to the camp during that November night. His head had been shaved, and its clothes exchanged for a coarse linen suit with a yellow star stamped onto it. It had become the badge of his shame, an excuse for the guards to beat him at every opportunity. His only link with the outside world, a snapshot of his wife, Rachel, and his small children, Simon and Ruth, was snatched from him by a guard who urinated over it. He wrote in his diary of the public hangings after morning roll call, which he was forced to witness, the public floggings before the afternoon roll call, and the drownings in vats after the evening count. In between were crucifixions, garrotings, and the speciality of one guard, castration by a bayonet. Men died and their bodies were borrowed away by their brothers to quicklime pits. Across on the far side of the vast Dachau complex, the foundations were being laid for what would become the crematoria. Then suddenly, incredibly, he and a group of other men were released on condition they all leave Germany within 14 days. They were driven out of the camp and dumped at Nuremberg station. There, waiting for him, aged and drawn but smiling, was Rachel with the children. She held a shabby suitcase filled with his clothes. She explained that her family had raised money to buy him a Cuba visa and tourist-class ticket on the St. Louis. He wept as she said that she and the children would follow later on another boat. "The most important thing, Aaron," Rachel insisted, "is for you to go and prepare a new life for us." Moments later, he had boarded the train to Hamburg. Aaron Posner knew his wife's parents would never be able to raise the money to send his family after him. that unless he was able to do so, he would never see any of them again. As the train steamed northward, despair over leaving the family so overwhelmed him that he decided to return to them. But as he tried to leave his compartment with his J labels plastered on the window and door at the Cologne station, a Gestapo official drove him back with a flurry of blows. In Hamburg had come that second beating outside the railway station. Others, too, ran the gauntlet of stormtroopers at the station, but the Lowe family were lucky. They had arrived in Hamburg in an hour when the Nazis' bully boys were diverting themselves by hounding Jews out of the city parks. Max Lowe, with a cunning that surprised his family, swiftly ushered them out of the station to wait in a safe place for the moment they could board the ship. For the past 3 weeks, waiting, hiding, and running had become second nature. He knew that neither his wife Elise nor Ruth, 17, or Fritz, 12, would ever really understand his fear. Unlike him, they had not been on the Gestapo's wanted list, prepared at a moment's notice to move from one place to another to avoid being caught and sent to a concentration camp. Max Lowe had been a successful attorney until a Reich Act removed him from practice in September 1938. He had wanted to leave then and obtained visas to take the family to England, but war was coming and even Britain had not seemed safe. He brought permits for Cuba. Still, Elise Lowe had not wanted to leave Germany, and they waited. Max Lowe made a living as an economic advisor, discreetly preparing briefs for trials and then handing them over to a friendly German lawyer to present in court. It was unsatisfying, and it was illegal. In April 1939, he learned the Gestapo had discovered his ruse. He was forced into hiding. In these past weeks, he had been pushed almost beyond terror as he waited for the day when he could surface long enough to join his family and make a train dash to Hamburg and board the St. Louis before the Gestapo were aware he had slipped through their net. When he had reappeared, Ruth and Fritz were shocked by the change. He was older, more nervous, irritable. His world had crumbled. He stood outside himself and could never return to his past life. His wife and children had tried to cheer him up on the journey to Hamburg. He had not responded, sitting in the train, smaller, shrunken, huddled in his clothes, looking much older than his 48 years. But when he arrived in Hamburg, he guided his family on a dangerous and deadly game of hide-and-seek, now alert and watchful, darting out of the way of any uniformed official, convinced each was a Gestapo officer waiting to take him. That same night, Otto Schendück, the acknowledged ringleader of the Nazi cabal on board the St. Louis, hurried ashore with the Gestapo firemen. Like other members of the crew, they had been granted shore leave. But Schendück and the Gestapo men did not follow their custom of spending time around the bars and brothels of Hamburg's Reeperbahn. Instead, they made their way to Gestapo headquarters. Afterward, Schendück went to the local office of the Abwehr. The crewmen who saw him enter the building did not realize until years later that this was a further indication that Schendück was what nobody on the St. Louis except the Gestapo firemen knew at the time, a courier of the German Secret Service. His position as party Leiter on the ship provided the perfect cover for this far more important role. Schendück had been recruited by the Abwehr in 1935 and within months shown himself highly adept at smuggling out classified material from German spy rings operating within the United States. By 1937, his name and reputation had even reached the ears of Admiral Canaris, head of the Abwehr. He looked on Schendück as one of his important links in the Nazi espionage claim, extending across America. By 1939, the Abwehr had more spies in the United States than almost anywhere else in the world. The agents channeled their information to New York to the Times Square area, close to the piers of the German shipping lines in the Hudson River. Before almost every voyage out of New York for many months past, Schendück attended a Treff, a secret meeting in one or more of the cafes or beer cellars on East 86th Street, the stronghold of German and often Nazi sympathies in New York. There, he received documents and blueprints, exchanging them for equally secret orders he brought from Hamburg. For star runners in its stable of couriers, the Abwehr was generous with expenses, and Schendück, a dumpy, unattractive man, found that the money brought him female company of a kind in both New York and Hamburg. Then, in the spring of 1939, in one swoop after another, the FBI broke link after link in the Abwehr spy chain. Stewards from a number of German ships were arrested, spies were picked up in many American cities, and indicated before grand juries. Before this last voyage out of New York, the Hapag Pier had teamed with FBI agents, police, and customs men who subjected the crew to a thorough search. They failed to find the hiding place Otto Schendick used to carry his information, almost certainly a sealed tube inserted in his anus, a means long favored by Abwehr agents. Now, in the Abwehr office in Midtown Hamburg, Schendick gave the information to his debriefing officer. Exactly what followed cannot be known in precise detail, but enough clues exist in surviving German intelligence records and the recall of crewmen to confirm that the meeting Schendick had with Commander Udo von Bonnem, head of the Abwehr section responsible for all espionage agents in America, was to affect, in varying degrees, the refugees on the St. Louis, the ship's captain, his crew, and the intelligence services of the United States. Although German intelligence had suffered severe blows in America, the need for updated information was greater than ever. With war drawing closer, it was vital for Germany to know the hidden strengths and weaknesses of the United States. The Abwehr had forged a new and elaborate chain to get secret information out of America to Havana, Cuba, where they maintained a highly organized espionage ring which had stockpiled American secrets, awaiting a safe means of bringing them to Germany. The material included blueprints of several American destroyers and specifications for an underwater sound detector which could be used against submarines. Otto Schendick and the St. Louis had been selected by von Bonnem as the safest and fastest method of upbringing those secrets to Germany. The plan, codenamed Operation Sunshine, was bold and simple. Schendick would go ashore in Havana, pick up the material, and return to the ship, which was scheduled to sail for Europe after only a day's stopover. Schendick was given $500, which he could use to bribe any inquisitive Cuban official. His contact was to be Robert Hoffman, assistant manager of the local Hapag office in Havana, the very office Captain Schroeder would have to rely on for help should he run into difficulties in Cuba.